Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. That's the tour that we're taking through my Penguin classics, one penguin at a time. And today we're doing the poems of Propertius. This is the Penguin classic, the W.G. Shepherd translation. He also translated Horace for them. And the book highlights something that we've been mentioning because we're dealing with these classics of the ancient world. We're mentioning over and over again the pitiless ratio of survival through which a lot of these things reach us, only barely. I've mentioned it before a couple of times, and in Propertius it reaches almost its worst case imaginable, because we have Propertius only by the wildest fluke of luck. He was fairly well known in his day. He was a friend to Ovid and Catullus and Tibullus. He was known by them. He was quoted by them. He was adapted and lampooned by them. He was known by the Roman public. It maybe wasn't the absolute front rank of poets, but he was turned into ditties. He was turned into parodies and literary pastiches. He was all over the booksellers' base of the hill. There were editions. He was well known, and yet almost lost to us for centuries. It was in 1420 that a man named Poggio Bracciolini found a manuscript of the poems of Propertius in a monastery. He used to loot monasteries and local libraries looking for old works, for old manuscripts, in a sense, with the idea that they might be valuable. Not in terms of money, but that they might be valuable in terms of reclaiming, rediscovering, reanimating the past. In fact, the virus of doing that would later blossom into the Italian Renaissance. Bracciolini was passionate about it, and he noticed this copy that had sat where it was for centuries, gathering mold and dust. And he took it, and he brought it to Florence, and he had it copied many times so that it would no longer be one single text. And only a little bit of time, 2 or 3 years after, he took that copy, which was the only copy of Propertius that has ever come to light. And only a tiny bit of time after Bracciolini took that copy from where he had found it, where it had sat for centuries, mice crawling over it, rain dipping in on it, people moving it all around, shuffling it all around, wondering on extra cold winter nights if maybe it was worth burning. Only a few years after Bracciolini took that copy from where he found it, floodwaters filled the entire room almost up to the ceiling and destroyed everything that was in there. Most of it meaningless ledgers and whatnot. But we came that close. The world came that close to having no Propertius at all. If Bracciolini hadn't turned left instead of right, noticed it, decided to take it, risked censure or being beaten up, if he hadn't done that right when he did, then right now in 2020, we would read about Propertius mentioned by Ovid. We would read about Propertius mentioned or alluded to by Tibullus or by Catullus, but we would have no Propertius. There would be no Penguin Classic. We would know him only as a name, like the many, many other names we know, for which we have nothing. That's how close he came. That's how pitiless the ratio was in this particular case. And it gets worse, of course, because that copy that Bracciolini saved dated from centuries before he found it in 1420 and was made 1,000 years after Propertius wrote anything. With no copies in between, no textual history, no copying history, no nothing like that. Imagine, just for a second, try imagining all the opportunities there are for mistakes, miscopying, changes. Imagine for a minute the tiny likelihood that the copy of Propertius's poems, which was battered and incomplete even when Bracciolini found it, imagine how small the likelihood is that version bears much resemblance to what Propertius actually wrote. Think about your own life. Think about how unlikely it is that a copy of a copy of a copy made centuries after, almost a millennia after the original was written, would be accurate. And boy, oh boy, it shows in the manuscripts that we have, the copies that were made from that copy, which was itself a copy of a copy. The manuscripts are all over the place. They're a mess. Propertius is full of emendations and gaps and mistakes and repetitions. You can think as well as I can, right, of any of the variables that would go into this. You get a surly 18-year-old copyist who's told by his boss, maybe his rapist, do this and have it done by morning. And maybe the copyist knows that his boss won't check it, or maybe the copyist is angry and wants to put mistakes in there. The text is entirely in his hands, and the future is totally at his mercy. What if a manuscript goes to a copyist who thinks, well, some of this is scandalous, and some of it I don't understand at all. some of these word choices, some of these metrical choices don't make any sense to me. It would never cross, of course, the people who think that way now and then. They always stay the same. That copyist, it would never cross that copyist's mind that perhaps the reason he doesn't understand the choices is because he's not as smart as Propertius, because he's not a poet of genius. And then maybe he ought to just copy what he sees and leave his judgments out of it. Let's say that 99% of copyists were ethical and did leave their judgments out of it. It doesn't matter. It only takes one, especially since we only have the one. The pipeline narrows to one manuscript. And that manuscript is the product of literal generations of copying. Somebody gets a word wrong. Pages stick together. A mouse eats a corner of a page. Anything can happen. Which explains why the Propertius that we have is such a mess. And it explains the fact that for centuries there was an old Latin motto that there are as many versions of Propertius as there are editors of Propertius. And that reflects the fact that if you take on the task of putting together an edition of Propertius, you're going to have to make stuff up, not lines on the page. Enough of that, I think, has been done. So we don't need any more of that. But you're going to have to impose structure. We know that some of these things probably have interconnections with each other. Some of them have a similar obsession. Propertius's obsessions tend to vary between a carping kind of biting observation of the events of his day, the war making of Augustus Caesar, for instance, and love poems, a love poem cycle to Cynthia, to his mistress, his grand obsession, Cynthia, who on the surface seems like the same kind of poetic obsession as Catullus's Lesbia, but they aren't. You read even what Propertius that we have now and what Catullus we have now. Don't get me started on Catullus. We will get to Catullus with his Daily Penguin. You put them side by side and there isn't any comparison. And it's easy to see why. You can tell it even if you don't know any Roman history. You can tell when you read the two love-obsessed poem cliches side by side, you can see right away what the difference is. I've had students spot it without me giving them any hint at all. Where they say, well, I ask them, okay, you read these two, what do you think? Almost universally, they say, well, I like the Catullus more. And I ask them, okay, why? Why? They're on the surface very similar kinds of poems. Why do you like the Catullus more? And they would always say some variation of, it just seems to mean it more. And every once in a while, I've had a student say, in response to more prodding, to more questions, well, he seems to mean it more because Lesbia seems like a real person, and Cynthia doesn't. Cynthia seems like, I had one kid decades ago say, Cynthia seems like just Hey Baby from a rock and roll song. An idealized, a generalized version of a love obsession, whereas Lesbia doesn't. And that's entirely true. I always give a little golf clap to those guys, to those students, after the fact. Because that's entirely true, and it does come out. Lesbia, of course, it was a real person. Lesbia is a made-up name, but Catullus was writing about one particular woman. And Propertius very probably is not. I think even if we were to learn a lot about Propertius, we know virtually nothing about him. But even if we were to learn something more about him, I don't think we would ever learn that he had one particular person in mind. So you have to put up with a bit of that. It's a little windier than Catullus. It's a little more high flown, and you don't know what you're getting. You don't know if it's Propertius at all. So I look on this as an old friend. I look on these reconstructions as old friends. But the old motto, the old Latin motto, is entirely true, which is that it makes a radically broad difference, editor to editor, in a way that it doesn't with a lot of other classical texts. The better preserved ones aren't like that at all. So when you get to the Shepherd translation, well, he's doing the best he can. He consulted with a large number of classicists and experts on this. Also, the Penguin Classic editor at the time, Betty Radis, was incredible, an amazing force of nature, and helped a lot to pierce through the murk and to help the translator to avoid translator ease. I don't know how successful it is. I'm going to read you a bit, and you can decide for yourself how successful this is. Midnight, a letter came from my mistress to me. She ordered me, without delay, to be at Tibur, where gleam-white peaks display twin towers, and Anio's waters fall to spreading pools. What shall I do? Trust myself to occluding darkness and fear for my limbs at insolent hands? Yet if I should defer her commission from fear, her weeping would be more cruel than mugging at night. I offended once, was thrust off for 1 whole year. She does not manage me with gentle hands. I think you'd be able to tell, even if you're a monoglot, I think you'd be able to tell that is relying heavily on a language that is not English. It doesn't feel quite natural as English. It feels like the author is doing the best he can to balance between faithfulness to Latin in this case and sense in English, and not quite succeeding. This is a fascinating edition. Really, despite the awkwardness that I think is hand in hand with any Propertius, I've only known one English version of these poems that wasn't at all awkward, and it isn't a Penguin Classic, unfortunately. But despite that, this is a really interesting version to read. Despite the boring cover, is this for another fresco? Yes, it is. This is for the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. This is another Pompeian fresco. But although I think this is a fascinating edition, I'm happy to have it in Penguin Classics. I wouldn't trade it out. But in this particular case, it's not the same as, like, for instance, a Penguin Classic edition of Charles Dickens. When it comes to Propertius especially, there are only a handful of other writers, especially ancient Romans, that I would use the same caution with. It really behooves you to read around. I will, of course, always recommend that you have a Penguin Classic. The Shepherd version is as good as any other, and the editorial infrastructure is really, really good. But it still behooves you to read around, because that old tag is right. There's a different Propertius for every editor and for every translator. So getting a handle on what is there and what can be done with what little we have left can only really be done by finding a bunch of different translations, reading as many as you can. Probably you can get examples of them online, of a number of them. I would try half a dozen English translations. Not necessarily in this case. Ordinarily, I make that recommendation in order to pick the translation that you're going to go with, like, for instance, when we're talking about the Odyssey. But in this case, no. In this case, I would say do that in order to get a feel for what's possible. You don't think you're going to have one favorite when it comes to Propertius. I don't. Although I do hope that you end up liking the poems, even whatever we have, whatever this is. It breaks my heart to think about all the things that it is not. Imagine that. He writes these poems when Caesar Augustus was drawing breath, when it was possible to walk by him in the Forum of ancient Rome. He writes these poems then. And the copy that Poggio finds was made probably in 8900. 8900. Whole empires had risen and fallen. Between the time when that copy was made in 8900 thereabouts by some bored monk, and when Propertius actually wrote anything like the original version. And that copy sat there for the lifespan, the rise, the flourishing, and the fall of other empires. It wasn't for another 500 years that it was found by Poggio, who happened to recognize that it might be something important, a name that he had only heard about but had never actually seen a manuscript for. So it's a little heartbreaking, but it's part and parcel of which better to have bits and pieces and miscellaneous fragments that we can then play an endless editorial game of piecing and repiecing than to have nothing at all. We came awful close to having nothing at all, to having only the word Propertius, to only knowing that there was a poet like that but never having anything. And that would be worse. That would be worse than this guessing game. So that's your Daily Penguin for today. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Thank you, Book 2.